Good evening. My name is Louis Malfaro. I work with the Texas American Federation of Teachers. So I want to build off what Representative Aycock asked to the other panelists. He said, testing has been used and abused, we get that. So where do we go from here? And he listed a number of areas that he feels an accountability system should address. Expectations for graduation, how do we measure student progress? How do we know we're getting a good return on our $34 billion investment? So let's assume that we decouple the high-stakes tests from the accountability and set aside the question of whether we even give them or not, because some of you have said, don't give these tests. Some of you have said, we've got to keep them. What are other ways that we can and should be looking at what happens in schools? And I'm asking you to talk a little bit about things like portfolio-based assessments, performance assessments, parent conferences and teacher grades, school quality reviews, and sampling tests like the NAEP, which everybody seems to think is the gold standard, and yet is not given to every child every year in every subject.
I'll go ahead and start to answer that. But we do have, as I mentioned, progress. We have multiple criteria legislation that has been filed every session for the past 10 years. And so I think that that's still a solution. I don't think we can legislate everything. I think we need a lot of leadership. We need professional development. But what we can do is, in the meantime, is create the structure for a process that is more inclusive of the students' work. There's portfolio-based assessment, authentic assessment, demonstration projects. There's all kinds of things that actually we know a lot about, that a lot of my colleagues in the College of Education, they have dedicated their lives to it. The issue is that we really haven't had much of a voice in state policy making to suggest the directions in which we should go.
Let me address the career-oriented side of the curriculum. I didn't get that specific in talking about this multiple pathways. There are plenty of opportunities for young people as long as they get the basics, and then let's say they move in a career-oriented direction. Well, how do you provide some accountability? It's relatively simple, because a lot of those students, if given the opportunity for career and technical education in high school, by the end of high school, by the end of their senior year, they can come out with an industry certified credential or a licensure, and that is a very good measurement. I mean, give you an example, Craft Training Center, which takes a lot of kids who'd be throwaways, dropouts in Corpus Christi. They're taking these students, they're teaching them to be welders, electricians, pipe fitters, other skilled trades, and by the time they graduate, they come out of school with an industry certified credential as a welder, and quite frankly, they're making very good money, particularly with Eagle Ford Shale. Young people can come out with a high school degree and make $1,700 a week, or go on then to get an associate's degree or a college degree. So I think that's one area. I'd like to see us get a, why can't we go back to using the Iowa standardized test at the grade school level, something that allows the schools to measure where people are and what they need to do in order to progress. At the high school level, you've got we took PSAT, SAT, ACT. They were, good measurements of where you are, and I think Carolyn's done a lot of the research on this issue. It's harder to game those tests than the current testing system we have. So really, we made things so complicated and so difficult. I think there are a lot simpler ways to measure. And again, I guess I was trying to make that comparison. This quantitative, everything is quantitative. You got to understand, I mean, there's got to be a qualitative analysis here of where the kids are when they start. I mean, I had a daughter that was teaching kids. They didn't, at first and second grade. Well, they didn't have any English before, she got them, and they're making a transition. English is a second language. I mean, there are so many factors here, and I think we can work through that with a sensible approach and getting everybody in the same room and not getting diverted into somebody's particular agenda on one side or the other.
I would just offer that I agree with what Tom says. I think in terms of either certification, career certification, or if you're on a college path, obviously SAT, ACT, or college enrollment. It's interesting, I sat on a public school charter board for 9 years until I stepped down about a year ago. And I can just tell you, when we sat in those board meetings, we never, I mean, almost rarely ever talked about standardized tests in terms of tax tests. We did ITBS testing at the beginning of the year, we did ITBS testing at the end of the year, and we just focused on measuring growth. And then we spent the majority of our time talking about where our kids were getting into school, what sort of scholarship dollars were they getting. It was a college prep public charter school. And there just wasn't a lot of discussion about passing rates or commended rates, because we felt like at the end of the day, if our kids were getting into college, and we felt like they were, and we track the students when they get to college and who persists after year one, who graduates, et cetera, that was the right way to go. So I think more of a fewer measurements that are more outcome-based, the more nationally normed they are, the better, because we have a sense for how we're stacking up against the rest of the country, is also important to me.
And one last comment. I think we have to go back and ask, why are we giving these tests? We heard at first when they began that it was going to be to determine if kids were college ready, career ready, prepared. What does it take to be ready for college in mathematics unless you are going to major in a math or science-based field? The latest research from the University of Louisville said the best predictor of success in college mathematics is Algebra 1 and some geometry. Never mentions Algebra 2. The courses that we're requiring and the tests, we require twice as many as any other high-stakes tests as any other state in the country, and generally 3 to 4 times as many. So when we look at the tests, I think tests are essential. We've always given tests, but I think it's how they're being used. We have the PEG grants in January, we have the STAR results in June, we have AYP in August. It's just one battering after the next. And yet it's how we're using some of those tests. We have too many. But I think we have to go back to what is the purpose of the test that we're giving, and give the tests that are essential. But we don't need to make all 15 high stakes. It should be used for diagnostic measures and reporting success at certain junctures, but not for preventing a kid from graduating from high school when he's got to take 15 of those tests.
Given our
I think Linda wants to jump in here, so Linda, and then we're going to go to another question.
I want to take that back just a little bit to the origin that was really focused on the kids and on what they're learning. And I think one thing that's been silenced by the standardization is the extraordinary expertise in the subject fields. If you look at the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, National Council of Teachers of English, other various science instructional fields, there's a very, very deep knowledge base, not just about how to teach, what the great resources are, how to foster thinking in those fields, but ways to capture the various goals even within that field. So keeping a longitudinal, I think the word portfolio is a little distracting, it can sound kind of scrapbooky, but if you keep a longitudinal record of kids' work, samples of their writing that they can look at, gee, I'm using more complex sentence structures in April than I was in November. Within our subject fields, we have a lot of depth, and a lot of teachers are trained in those and are part of these professions. And a lot of the teacher bashing that's been used to justify this very remote standardization has silenced a lot of that expertise. So people think it's not there. Well, it's not there in the pink building you were talking about necessarily, but we have those things. And the other thing that's very important to mention in terms of ethics, it is unethical to ever use a test of a child's learning for any purpose it was not designed for and validated for. There has never been a test of children's learning. There has never been a test of children's learning that was designed to measure a principal's performance, to measure the quality of a school, and now especially to measure the impact of a teacher. They don't exist. So every time we are mandating that school professionals do that, it's like mandating malpractice. So going back to really looking at what are all the things we want to know about how a school is working. Is it safe? Do teachers line up to teach there? Do parents send their little kids there after the big kids went there? Is there a fabulous math program? Are there arts? Are there sports? what's going on there that's wonderful, and sending in peer review teams to look at those things as well as look at student work. So we have a lot of expertise about how to look at schools, how to look at principals and their role, how to evaluate teaching, and how to evaluate kids' learning. And right now, by smushing them all into this one indicator, we lose expertise that over the last century has been developed and is there and doesn't cost $500 million to implement.
All right, thank you. We're going to try to be, we're in the, up here, going to try to be a little quicker too, so we get more questions. First one on this side.
Okay. I'm Akun Rothi. I'm a student at UT. First, I just want to thank all of you guys for coming out here. Being a broke college kid, it's kind of nice to be able to come to seminars and not have to pay tuition to learn. So I was interested in the stats given on Pearson and how kind of just in general the kind of wave of privatization when it comes to school, like school reform as it's called. And I don't want to get too off topic here, but I was kind of wondering if what your thoughts were on just like school voucher systems and private charter schools and stuff like that, how that is related to accountability in schools and how that relates to moving on to college.
Well, I'll be really quick. Charter schools or public schools? I heard several people who should have known better this weekend talk about the public schools and the charter schools. They're all public schools. Some are traditional, some are charter. As far as vouchers, raise your hand. Texas opposes them in whatever form they choose to appear.
I believe in public education. I believe in, it's interesting. I'll just tell you this. Like I said, I mentioned, when in higher ed, we seem very comfortable with a system where you can go big or small, private or public, in-state, out-of-state. And I struggle with a system which allows you in K through 12 to basically to have one choice. And so I'm not in favor of vouchers at all. I believe that high-quality public charter schools should be allowed, and I think they should be allowed to grow. But I think also we should have active legislation that closes poor-performing charter schools.
Absolutely.
Okay. Next question over here.
Yes. Kind of speaking to Pauken, we kind of have we're a state committed to the rhetoric of freedom and having local autonomous control. So we're taking the control away from the teachers with the boots on the ground in our local school systems, and kind of getting to Aycock and getting to the solutions. What are the barriers to having more local community board input on outcomes, as well as more teacher autonomy and requirements that match college that were spoken to, and kind of what are the obstacles to, it seems as if everyone in the room is in agreement, what are the obstacles to getting to some of these common sense solutions that everyone tends to agree upon?
Well, let me just briefly address it. I think the problem is both state and federal level with No Child Left Behind, and one of the architects of that is also the architect here in Texas of our high-stakes testing system. And I think the farther you remove control of education from the local people, again, it gets very theoretical, but it isn't working very well. I think that I'm very much opposed to unfunded federal and state mandates, and I think that you've gotten, if you can go to a system, for example, in education, multiple pathways where, for example, every student to get a high school degree would have a minimum of 2 maths, 2 sciences, 3 or 4, I'd like to see 4 English and some other, the liberal arts area. Then you have a concentration, so all students would get kind of core curriculum. And then you would have an option for the students to move in a career-oriented direction. And the measurement there is by how they're moving towards getting an industry-certified credential. The measurement in terms, as Todd said earlier, how do they do on the ACT and SAT? And we've had this system in place. In 2000, the teaching to the test system we're seeing no improvements in the SAT or SAT or ACT scores. And so I think that I would argue that the current system really hurts those students who are oriented to wanting to go to college and might want to emphasize more humanities and fine arts or math and science. It's just this, as others have said, it's a one-size-fits-all approach. So recognize that there needs to be accountability, but there's a more qualitative approach to accountability, and let the local parents and are not, if they're not happy, and local business and industry leaders, if they're not seeing results from the local school system, it's just like Todd was saying earlier, people look, they move into an area where there's a good school district. And in our urban areas, we've got to start saving those kids who are dropping out of school. And so I think that a lot of this, it's just like in Dallas. Now there are a group of community leaders coming together because they're very concerned about their independent school district. And I just think we got to have more confidence. Sure, there are going to be mistakes in the local leadership, and have just a more generalized accountability system rather than this overly restricted 4x4 curriculum, and in effect a teaching to the test mentality, which averages in terms of preparation or testing 40 days out of the year and takes people away from real learning in the course subject.
Let me jump in.
Sure, and then we'll go.
To your question about how to begin to change it. In our committee hearings, the thing that is common theme through all the things that we hear is that parental involvement and community involvement is essential to the movement and progress of schools. I think as you move farther up the pecking order, or the feeding chain, or whatever you want to call it, from local control, parents feel more disengaged and the community feels more disengaged. It's much easier. I have two small districts. I have a Lomita, which has just a few hundred students, and in my new district I'll have Salado, about the same size. Then I have a great big one, Killeen, 43,000. One size fitting all is very difficult to hold the parental and community involvement in those two settings. Because in one, the school is the community. In the other, it's hard to get that involvement. And so I think part of what we need to evaluate when we evaluate a district, or perhaps even a campus, is some metric of how do you pull parents and community into involvement with that school. I think if you can involve the parents and the community, you'll see a lot of these other answers come into play. It's when we go down the road here to the big pink building and say, well, one size has got to fit all. I think that's when it goes to getting to be problematic. The farther you move away from local control, the more slippage there is, for lack of a better term, both financially and accountability-wise and every other way.
Linda?
As you think about the barriers, this idea of local control, local involvement is very important, because the more the political power, the more the decision-making is centralized in Washington or in Austin, the easier it is for big, powerful, moneyed interests like the testing companies, their lobbyists, I hate this phrase, but the education industrial complex. There are a lot of people, and I just named a few of the absurd costs. I'm really missing Molly Ivins here right now. We need to call out and say, don't let these big moneyed interests, many of them just want to make money off the testing and all the high-tech stuff that goes for scoring it. Others really want us to outsource our poor kids to their charter chains, and not all charters are public. We have some in Houston, like Early College, Challenge Early College High School, which is a public Houston ISD school. All the employees are HSD teachers. The kids are HSD kids. They have a charter to do some real different early career things. But we also have a lot of people that want our tax dollars to use for their organization, which is not democratically governed. It is not our public organization. So public tax dollars need to go with public governance. And so when you have so many you have a lot of people seeing education tax dollars as their opportunity to get rich. And if they can scare people with a single indicator and show our schools are failing, well, hello, why are some of us failing? Because we're stealing the money out of the classroom to pay for the testing system. So these third graders don't have lobbyists. Seventh grade teachers don't have lobbyists. So this idea of local control and parents really knowing what's going on and then working together with other parent groups across the state to say what is happening, who's making decisions, who's beholden to whom, and what can we do about it by having this collective voice heard. And I think that's why that resolution has possibility. If it stays a piece of paper, we'll have an incredible opportunity that's been missed.
And what I'd like to add to that, is that under this system also, we've had a community that has systematically been underprivileged by it, okay? This battle began more than a decade ago. And what gets in the way is that there has been a community that has systematically benefited from the system. And so I think that we need to own up to the privilege that has existed in this room. The fact that we're here has to do with the egregious legislation that was passed in 2009. And so ideology also has a big impact in how we think about when it is that other people's children are hurting and getting hurt by the system.
Thank you. Okay. So
I do have another concern. I do have another concern, Mr. Pauken. I want to ask you, I was a late bloomer. If I had gone put on the pathway, I wouldn't be here today. So how are you going to help someone like me who went through a high school, or would have gone under your framework, gone through a particular pathway or tracking system and structure myself out of a four-year college opportunity?
So I'm just gonna ask us to hold that.
No, I don't see how, I don't quite get where you're going. This is really student choice, parents' choice. You're saying you have two different pathways to go to college, and then those who choose the opportunity can go in a career-oriented pathway. Quite frankly, we have really shut down a lot of the career and technical programs around the state because of this 4x4 very restrictive system, and kids being pulled out of career and technical education classes, and a lot of them wind up dropping out of school who might otherwise have finished high school because they learn the relevance of academics through beginning to work with their hands or getting into career and technical education. All I'm talking about is kids learn differently. We have to recognize it. We're not talking about imposing different tracks on kids, happen to come from different backgrounds.
So I'm going to ask, I'm going to remind our panelists again that we have a lot of people waiting to ask questions, and it might actually help if you want to direct your question to someone in particular, if you can. So we want to get as many of these questions in as possible. So.